This voice is artificial, but the ideas are real. Welcome to AI Podcast. Now, let's begin.
Okay, let's unpack this. We are diving deep into a case that feels less like a crime and more like a permanent fixture in American mythology. The unsolved murder of 6-year-old JonBenét Ramsey.
It really is. I mean, this case, the tragedy in Boulder, Colorado, back in 1996, it sits at this strange, extraordinary intersection of celebrity wealth and, well, profound investigative failure.
Yeah.
And the fact that it's still unsolved, nearly 3 decades later, it's often used as a benchmark for just how complicated and heartbreaking a cold case can really be.
And that's really the mission for this deep dive. We've got source material that pulls apart those frantic, chaotic first few hours of the investigation, reviews the major competing theories that drove investigators, frankly, a little mad, and then pivots pretty dramatically to the present day, how the revolution in DNA forensics, and specifically the rise of forensic genealogy, could potentially solve a case that was contaminated almost beyond repair right from the start.
It really forces you to analyze that conflict between human error and what feels like technological perfection.
Yeah.
Can a catastrophic initial failure be overcome by 21st century science?
That's the question. So let's go back to that specific moment in time. The day after Christmas, December 26, 1996. The setting is the Ramsey family home in Boulder, a wealthy, quiet enclave.
And JonBenét, this child beauty queen, is missing. The very beginning of this whole saga is defined by one sound.
Patsy Ramsey's 911 call.
Her hysterical 911 call at 5:52 in the morning. And that call immediately brings law enforcement into a crime scene that, unbeknownst to them, it was already severely compromised.
Right. Patsy is frantic. She's claiming her daughter was kidnapped. And the key piece of immediate evidence, which is arguably the most bizarre element of the entire tragedy, is the ransom note.
That note.
Yeah.
It's so central to everything.
It's absolutely central to the whole mess, primarily because of its length and its content. It was 2.5 pages long.
Which is it's incredibly long for someone who's supposedly in a rush and trying to stay hidden.
Exactly. And it demanded a highly specific, very strange amount of money. $118,000.
And that specificity it's a critical little nugget of insight that a casual observer might just miss. It wasn't a round number like 100,000 or $500,000.
No.
Our sources confirm what investigators immediately found so suspicious. $118,000 was almost exactly the amount of John Ramsey's Christmas bonus that year.
Wow.
And that detail suggested this intimate knowledge of the family's finances, which, immediately steered suspicion toward either an inside job or some kind of targeted revenge plot.
It instantly transforms the note from just a generic kidnapping demand into this chillingly personalized piece of staging. And of course, the note had the explicit, terrifying threat. If the police were contacted, JonBenét would be killed. It also promised a follow-up call between 8 and 10 a.m. for further instructions.
But here's the heartbreaking reality that really defined the case. The murder victim, JonBenét, was still inside the house. She was in the basement while her mother was making that hysterical 911 call. And while the police were sitting there, waiting for a call that was never going to come.
We know the official cause of death was a combination of strangulation, likely, with a makeshift garrote and severe head trauma.
Which means the ransom note wasn't a demand for an exchange. It was a distraction. It was an elaborate cover-up.
That fact alone just sets the stage for suspicion to land immediately, where it almost always does in these tragedies. Which, brings us directly to part one, the initial catastrophic flaws of the investigation.
Yeah, and law enforcement protocols are very clear on this point. Our sources underscore the inherent bias, even if it's warranted. In nearly every case of a child murdered at home, the parents are the prime suspects.
They have to be.
The focus was immediately on John and Patsy Ramsey because they were the last 2 people confirmed to have seen her alive.
And the broader context, it really didn't help them at all, did it? JonBenét's public persona, the elaborate costumes, the beauty pageants, all that public exposure, it acted like an accelerant on the media frenzy.
It really did. Her participation in those pageants amplified the public's focus, and it fueled this intense speculation linking her death to potential sexual exploitation, whether that was actually warranted by the facts of the crime or not.
So you have this enormous amount of public pressure, which just made the investigative errors that followed even more devastating. We have to understand that the initial scene management was, to put it bluntly, a catastrophe.
It was. Just irreversible damage done in those first few hours.
It's hard to read about without physically cringing. You have Detective Linda Arndt instructing John Ramsey and a family friend, Fleet White, to conduct their own unsupervised walk-through search of the house.
That is the moment. That is the moment where the chain of custody essentially disintegrated. Arndt, who was the first detective on the scene, basically cleared the house for private citizens to just wander through. She advised them to start searching on the top floor and finish in the basement.
And John Ramsey, operating under, unimaginable psychological stress, did exactly that. He headed directly to the basement and specifically to the wine cellar room, and that's where he found JonBenét's body. She was wrapped in a white blanket.
And this is where the contamination becomes, well, fatal to the case. John Ramsey's actions when he found her, while you can understand them from a distressed parent's perspective, they were just disastrous for the integrity of the evidence.
What did he do?
He ripped the duct tape off her mouth. He loosened the ties on her wrist. He then picked up her body and moved her upstairs, carrying her through the house to the living room.
He moved the body. Just think about what that single action compromises. I mean, if there were trace fibers, hairs, fingerprints, any potential DNA from an assailant on the body, on the blanket, the floor, the tape.
It's all either displaced, destroyed, or now hopelessly intermingled with the Ramsey's own DNA, with fibers from the living room carpet, with anyone else who touched that blanket. It's a forensic nightmare.
And remember, Fleet White, the friend, he was also searching the basement. He found a piece of broken glass down there. By walking through, searching, touching, and moving things, both men fundamentally altered a critical crime scene before a proper forensic team could even secure it.
The initial scene was, for all intents and purposes, destroyed.
And let's not forget key pieces of evidence that were compromised right away. The makeshift weapon used to strangle her, the garrote, a piece of cord, and a broken paintbrush handle that was handled. If that paintbrush handle came from inside the house or if it had the assailant's fingerprints.
That crucial context was immediately lost when the body was moved. It's the definition of a cold case, not because of a lack of evidence, but because of a total lack of integrity of the evidence.
So any defense in any future trial would have a field day challenging the source and placement of literally every single physical finding. That initial breakdown still haunts Boulder Police to this day.
It certainly does. But despite those flaws, the investigation that followed was enormous, which really just highlights the sheer complexity of the crime itself.
Okay, so let's move to part two, because the size of that effort, it's staggering, and it's why, despite all that work, the case remained cold.
The scope of the investigation 5 years out was, well, it was staggering. Our sources note 650 interviews conducted, 140 suspects questioned, and this wasn't just local. They cast a really wide net.
Wow.
Following up on 5,300 tips, spending $1.7 million, consulting 60 different experts, and compiling 43,000 pages of information based on 1,300 pieces of evidence. Yet, they could not secure an indictment.
The sheer enormity of the resources deployed, it tells you two things, right? The case was high profile enough to warrant all that attention, but the evidence was ambiguous enough to support multiple, equally plausible theories. So let's review those four major scenarios our sources outline, starting with the one that was most immediate and, frankly, most common.
That would be scenario 1, parental homicide and cover-up. This theory posits that Patsy Ramsey was the actual killer, possibly accidentally. It drew heavily on the commonality that parents are prime suspects, and of course the highly specific, personal nature of that ransom note's monetary demand, the $118,000.
And the motive they often cited was a moment of uncontrolled rage. Maybe JonBenet wet the bed, or there was a violent argument about her involvement in the pageant circuit. Patsy was specifically noted by people close to the family as being highly controlling and very invested in JonBenet's pageant success.
So if the death was accidental, the theory suggests Patsy panicked, and John, the corporate CEO, used his influence and intelligence to stage the elaborate scene. That includes writing that bizarre theatrical ransom note, all to protect his wife. It's a tragic narrative, but it accounts for the note, the immediate cleanup, and the extreme suspicion surrounding them.
Then you have the second scenario, which is what I think most people initially imagined, the intruder theory. A stranger broke into the house.
And this scenario often focused on the possibility of a sexually motivated assailant, maybe a pedophile who had seen JonBenet at one of her pageants or otherwise knew of her. The house, being a large estate, offered several potential points of entry, including a broken basement window. This theory really hinges on the idea that the killer was an unknown outsider who executed a clean, successful crime.
Which, if that's true, it puts the case into a different, much more chilling context of professional or maybe even serial crime, which we can touch on later. But scenario 3 introduces a different, more specific external motive: targeted revenge.
This is a complex theory. It suggests the culprit hated John Ramsey because of a business dealing, a financial transaction that went wrong, or some deeply personal rivalry. The goal wasn't just robbery or sexual gratification. It was revenge, achieved by destroying the most precious thing in Ramsey's life, his daughter.
And the specificity of the $118,000 demand could potentially support this theory too, right? Depending on who had that intimate financial knowledge.
Exactly. It changes the crime from a random act of violence or a panic-driven cover-up
Yeah.
into this calculated, almost corporate assassination of character and happiness.
And then we have the fourth, and I think maybe the most curious theory involving the language of the ransom note itself: kidnapping gone awry by teenagers.
Yes, this theory is heavily based on forensic linguistics. The sources highlight that the peculiar language and syntax used in the note, which was highly theatrical and full of cinematic dialogue,
Right.
it strongly resembled expressions and idioms found in popular 1990s films and media. Investigators specifically found parallels with dialogue from movies like Speed, Ransom, and the classic Dirty Harry, as well as specific language used in TV shows and video games that were popular with teens at the time.
So you have this sloppy, overly long note written by someone trying desperately to sound like a sophisticated criminal, but instead they sound like someone who learned how to write a ransom note from a movie script.
Exactly. It suggests immaturity, panic, and a severe lack of planning, which could have led to an accidental death during an attempted kidnapping. The evidence just pulled the investigation in too many directions: family, revenge, intruder, panicked youth. This fragmentation of evidence, combined with that initial scene contamination, is why the judicial system ultimately stalled.
And that stalling came to a head in 1999 with the grand jury. They were tasked with reviewing all of this evidence and deciding if an indictment was warranted for anyone, including the Ramseys.
And their decision was that there was insufficient evidence to indict anyone. The secrecy surrounding those proceedings became its own kind of cold case phenomenon. Our sources confirmed that the deliberations of that grand jury remain the best-kept secret in Boulder County.
And that's because Colorado law is extremely strict on this, right? It forbids jurors from speaking about the proceedings until an indictment is handed down or a final public report is issued.
Correct. And since neither of those things happened, the truth of why the jury decided what it did and what specific evidence led them to rule out certain theories, it's all locked away under penalty of law.
Which leaves the JonBenét case in this kind of permanent limbo. A monumental investigation that produced only 4 viable, competing theories and a legal wall of silence. This enduring mystery sets the perfect stage for our next transition: the vast systemic crisis of cold cases in the U.S. and the technological leap that offered a lifeline. Here's where the perspective shifts entirely from the tragic chaos of one house in Boulder to a national problem that needed a radical solution. We're talking about the crisis of cold cases.
It's an enormous burden on the entire justice system and on public safety. Criminologists have tracked an alarming ongoing rise in unsolved violent crimes. And stacked on top of that mountain of cold cases is the massive backlog of untested DNA evidence.
Just how massive are we talking?
The estimates vary wildly, but the numbers are always staggering. Anywhere from 200,000 to 300,000 untested DNA samples are just sitting in storage. And that doesn't even count the potential samples that were never collected due to lack of resources. The total number of viable samples that could potentially solve cases could be closer to 1 million.
Wow. That inventory of untapped evidence represents thousands of potential offenders who are still walking free. And as our sources note, many violent defendants who are released are rearrested within 5 years, meaning these unsolved crimes pose a constant, ongoing threat.
They do. And this is precisely why, starting in the mid-1980s, DNA analysis became the undeniable foundation of modern forensics. Sir Alec Jeffreys discovering DNA typing in 1985, the idea that every individual has a unique genetic identifier, that was a watershed moment.
It changed everything.
It did. And shortly after, Peter Gill established the Forensic Science Service. The promise was absolute. DNA could establish indisputable evidence and ensure accuracy and fairness in a way no other evidence type could.
So the mechanism the U.S. developed to harness this power is the database system we hear about all the time: CODIS and NDS. Let's spend a moment making sure we all know exactly how this works, because it's so crucial for understanding the Ramsey case limitation.
Okay, so the Combined DNA Index System, CODIS, is essentially the infrastructure. It connects national, state, and local forensic labs. It is designed to search forensic evidence, The DNA profiles recovered from a crime scene, which is the forensic index, against the DNA profiles of convicted offenders.
And that's the key distinction, right? It only searches against people who are already in the system, the convicted offender index.
Exactly. And the National DNA Index System, NDIS, is the actual federally administered database maintained by the FBI that contains all those convicted offender profiles. It grew exponentially. By 2019, NDIS contained over 13.6 million offender profiles. This is a powerful, official, and very strictly regulated system.
Which tragically brings us right back to JonBenét Ramsey. We know that crucial touch DNA evidence was recovered from the crime scene, specifically DNA belonging to an unknown male on her underwear.
Right. But the enduring fact is that investigators found no match in the combined DNA index system to charge the killer.
So in 1999, that was the end of the line. The killer wasn't a convicted felon in the database, so the trail just went cold. But the world today, the world we live in now, has completely changed the limits of that search through the rise of forensic genealogy.
This is the game changer. This is the informal method that just bypasses CODIS entirely.
It really is a revolution. The classic example that proved this was the identification of the Golden State Killer, Joseph James DeAngelo, in 2018. The process is audacious. Investigators took the ancient DNA evidence from the crime scenes and uploaded the genetic profile, the specific markers, to a public commercial genealogy website, GEDmatch.
And the goal wasn't to find the killer directly, because his profile wasn't there.
Right.
The goal was to find a distant family member, a second cousin, a third cousin, who had voluntarily uploaded their DNA looking for their ancestry. It's incredible.
It is. So once they had a familial link, investigators worked backward, using traditional detective work, public records, census data, and other tools to build out a detailed family tree. By narrowing down the suspects through age, proximity, and known family lines, they eventually identified DeAngelo, obtained his discarded DNA,
From a car door handle, or maybe a tissue.
and secured a direct, undeniable match to the crime scene evidence. The whole investigative paradigm just shifts entirely.
It really does. Traditional CODIS searches offer you a binary yes or no answer based on millions of specific profiles. Genealogy offers a holistic view of a suspect's family history. It uses a small amount of DNA to open up this multi-generational geographic and historical search.
It offers resolution where previously there was only a brick wall. But this groundbreaking technological power immediately raised massive legal and ethical tensions. I mean, if my cousin uploads their spit to a public site and that leads the police to me, what happens to my Fourth Amendment rights?
That is the central and very legitimate privacy concern. Proponents argue that using DNA left at a crime scene is fundamentally no different than using a fingerprint or a shoe print left behind. You have no reasonable expectation of privacy for abandoned evidence.
But critics argue DNA is far more invasive. It doesn't just identify you, it provides this huge swath of information about your entire lineage, your medical predispositions, the potential crimes of your relatives. It's a deep dive into your entire genetic identity.
It is. Yet the courts have seemingly sided with the proponents, establishing pretty clear precedent. DeAngelo's attorneys challenged the use of the genealogical evidence on Fourth Amendment grounds, arguing that this constituted an unreasonable search and seizure of family information.
And that challenge failed.
It failed. The critical legal ruling established that DNA discarded at a crime scene holds no expectation of privacy. Furthermore, individuals who upload their DNA to public databases like GEDmatch, especially before the rules changed slightly, often agreed to terms of service that allow their data to be utilized for law enforcement searches. The precedent is set. If the evidence is discarded, you've essentially waived your right to privacy over that material.
So we have a revolutionary, legally tested tool that can solve decades-old cases. But DNA analysis isn't only about catching criminals. It has a profound, necessary dual role in justice: conviction and exoneration.
And that dual role is a massive reckoning for the criminal justice system. It forces us to face the failures of the past. The improved technology demands that we reevaluate older convictions, and it often reveals terrible injustice. By 2020, over 375 people in the United States had been exonerated through post-conviction DNA testing.
And when you break down the human cost of that, it's truly staggering. Those individuals collectively served an average of 14 years each in prison. That is thousands of years of human life lost due to systemic failures that predated reliable DNA forensics.
When you look closely at the primary causes of these wrongful convictions, you really see the cracks in the old system. Eyewitness misidentification, which we know is notoriously unreliable, was a factor in over 65% of exonerations.
65%, that's a huge margin of error, just based on human memory under duress.
Absolutely. Then you have the failures of the state's own tools. Misapplication of evidence by forensic scientists or investigators occurred in approximately 40% of cases. And perhaps most chillingly, almost 30% of exoneration cases involve false confessions, people being pressured or manipulated into admitting to crimes they did not commit.
We can't just talk about these as statistics, though. We have to attach a human narrative to them. Let's look at the Gary Dotson case study, because it was the first DNA exoneration case in U.S. history, and it vividly illustrates just how deeply flawed the justice system was before this technology.
Dotson was convicted in the late 1970s of sexual assault, and the evidence was flimsy even by the standards of the time. It rested primarily on vague serology evidence, type B blood antigens found in the sexual assault kit and hair analysis.
And the type B blood factor is crucial here because our sources remind us that the victim, Kathleen Crowell, was type B herself.
Right, and more than 10% of white males in the general population also have type B blood. The evidence was only exclusionary, not inclusionary. It was anything but definitive proof.
And the hair analysis was basically junk science, or at least dangerously exaggerated. The technology of the era could only compare hair samples based on physical characteristics. Yet the prosecutor in Dotson's trial exaggerated the conclusions, claiming the hair was like Dotson's, which led the jury to believe it was a near certainty.
And we also know that Dotson's defense attorney, Paul Foxgrover, failed utterly to challenge blatant inconsistencies. Crowell described a clean-shaven man who drove a specific car. Dotson had a clearly outgrown mustache and owned a completely different vehicle. He was convicted and sentenced to 25 to 50 years.
So the conviction stuck. But then the system had a chance to self-correct. In 1985, 8 years into his sentence, the victim, Kathleen Crowell, now married as Kathleen Crowell Webb, she recanted her testimony.
To her pastor, yeah. She admitted she had fabricated the entire sexual assault story to cover up consensual sex with her boyfriend, David Burney, the day before the alleged attack.
So the science was flawed, the defense was inadequate, and now the victim herself admits the crime never happened as she reported it. Surely that should lead to an immediate release.
You'd think so, but not at all. The court system, steeped in skepticism of recantations, held a new hearing. And it was here that forensic science, even pre-DNA, offered compelling evidence of foul play in the conviction.
Okay, tell us about the science presented at that hearing.
Forensic serologist Edward T. Black testified. He compared the evidence recovered from the rape kit, and he noted a critical inconsistency. The concentration of spermatozoa found on Crowell's underpants was 2 or 3 times greater than the concentration found on the vaginal swab taken immediately after the alleged assault.
Wait, so if the rape had just occurred, the concentration should have been high on the swab, but the higher concentration on the underpants suggests activity that happened much earlier.
Precisely. This scientific inconsistency strongly suggested this sexual assault could not have occurred at the time claimed by Crowell in her original trial testimony. The evidence was fully consistent with her new confession that she had had sexual activity with her ex-boyfriend, Byrne, the day prior. Henry C. Lee, a very famous forensic scientist, confirmed these findings.
So the scientific evidence corroborated the recantation, yet the trial judge, Richard L. Samuels, disregarded it completely. He deemed Crowell Webb's original fabricated trial testimony more credible than her recantation and the new science.
It's unbelievable. He ordered Dotson's bond revoked, and he was sent straight back to prison. It's just a profound moment of institutional failure. The system prioritized maintaining the sanctity of the original verdict over the pursuit of truth, despite overwhelming evidence.
So it wasn't until 1988, when DNA testing finally became precise enough to be court admissible, that tests proved the semen belonged to Byrne, the ex-boyfriend. 12 years after his initial conviction, he was finally acquitted.
The injustice is almost unbearable to process, and the immediate aftermath of that exoneration shows that the damage done by the justice system isn't easily repaired by a simple release order.
No, the long-term impact is devastating. Dotson struggled significantly, turning to alcohol and substances upon release, and was arrested again shortly thereafter for domestic assault. His story tragically highlights the profound psychological toll of wrongful imprisonment.
And studies confirm this is the norm, not the exception. Approximately 6% of all criminal convictions are estimated to lead to unlawful imprisonment. The psychological consequences are severe and permanent.
Participants in psychological studies reported permanent shifts in personality and self-identity. They suffered from severe anxiety, deep depression, paranoia, hostility, and chronic PTSD. Over half of the study participants suffered from debilitating PTSD and night terrors years after their release.
They describe a comprehensive feeling of being lost. Not just a loss of time, but a loss of hope, loss of self, loss of purpose, and loss of future dignity. It fundamentally changes a person's ability to engage with the world.
And the trauma extends outside the prison walls. Their reputation is ruined, leading to intense social isolation, divorce, custody battles. And crucially, many participants emphasize that the system's lack of apology or acceptance of responsibility for their wrongful conviction compounded their negative feelings, leaving them feeling shamed and constantly afraid of being falsely accused again.
That pressure to restore trust in the system, to prevent future systemic failures, and to bring justice for victims like JonBenét Ramsey is what drives the continued urgency in these high-profile cold cases.
And that leads us logically to our final context. We can't discuss cases that remain cold without acknowledging the brutal reality of serial crime and the profile of offenders who manage to evade capture for decades.
Right, so Part 5 places the Ramsey case back into that chilling, broader context of violence. If we assume the intruder theory scenario 2 is correct, we are dealing with a known, yet incredibly difficult, criminal profile.
The sheer number of unidentified serial offenders is sobering. Our sources estimate there are 2,000 serial killers in the U.S. who have never been prosecuted, accounting for anywhere from 200 to 2,000 victims yearly.
And the statistics tell a very specific story about these types of crimes. Serial murderers are believed to account for a large percentage, around 25 to 28% of all homicides classified as having unknown circumstances. When the police don't have a lead, it often means they are dealing with a highly sophisticated repeat offender.
And the profiles developed by the FBI suggest these individuals are typically cunning, intelligent, and more cruel than crazy. They're capable of controlling their urges, executing meticulous plans, and avoiding the common mistakes that land most perpetrators in the CODIS database. Their capture often relies on sheer luck, a traffic stop, a secondary, sloppy crime, rather than investigative failure.
So in the Ramsey case, you have this double difficulty. You have the catastrophic human failure of scene contamination in 1996. And if the intruder theory holds, you have a criminal who was intelligent and controlled enough to execute the crime flawlessly and disappear without a trace.
Exactly. The case is a confrontation between the two major weaknesses in forensics, the early human element and the inherent difficulty of capturing a sophisticated offender.
And yet we now live in the era of genealogical DNA. We've discussed the initial failure of John Ramsey moving the body, ripping off the duct tape, and forever compromising the scene's integrity. We understand that the unidentified male DNA found on JonBenét's clothing did not match the official CODIS database.
But that DNA profile still exists. And it exists in a world where, thanks to the Golden State Killer precedent, law enforcement has proven it can overcome decades of investigative silence by searching public genetic data, establishing familial links, and finally obtaining an undeniable biological match.
It makes us confront how far the technology has outpaced the initial human mistakes. The initial contamination might have made fingerprints, fibers, and footprints useless, but the underlying biological truth, the killer's specific DNA markers, remains.
The future of this case lies squarely in that confrontation. Can undeniable biology finally cut through the messy, tragic complexity created by the initial human errors of December 1996?
That really is the ultimate synthesis of our deep dive. The sources show us two divergent histories. The history of the Ramsey tragedy, defined by institutional silence and complexity, and the history of modern forensics, defined by the breathtaking success of leveraging familial public data.
The DNA evidence in the Ramsey case is currently an orphan profile. It has no match in the official system. But it exists in a legal environment where the Supreme Court precedent is clear. Discarded DNA holds no right to privacy, and familial searches of public databases are legally sanctioned.
So we leave you with this final provocative thought, one that is reshaping the future of justice. Given the need for resolution in this tragic, decades-old case, how far should law enforcement agencies ethically and logistically go in leveraging familial searches of public and private genetic databases to match the DNA found on the body of JonBenét Ramsey?
This is a question that balances the public trust and the family's fundamental need for justice against the ultimate privacy concerns of every distant cousin whose genetic data resides on a public website. The resolution of this specific, enduring mystery is now less about traditional policing and more about evolving ethics and undeniable biology. It's a conversation we are all collectively having right now.